want to pass it over to Madeline to give a quick intro about our partner FUSEE and talk about a little bit about what they're all about.
Cool, thanks Dylan. Yeah, my name is Madeline. Like Dylan said, I've been volunteering with Cascadia Wildlands for a while, but I also primarily work with FUSEE, which stands for Firefighters United for Safety Ethics and Ecology. And looks like Sam's pulling up the our little logo slide there. But so we're a local nonprofit based in Eugene, and we work on the intersection between industrial forestry, wildland fire, and climate change. And we do a lot of critique of the fire industrial complex, so to speak. It's yeah, check us out on Facebook, on social media, and also on our website at fusee.org. I'm really excited to be here and with my comrade Michael Beasley, who's also a FUSEE founding board member. So we work closely together. So guess we'll get started, right?
Great. So Sam, do you want to just go to the third slide? Sam, you there?
Yeah, I just did it. It's on the third slide.
Oh, okay. Maybe I'm getting some lag here.
Hmm.
So one of the myths that we kind of hear a lot is that our forests are being destroyed by catastrophic wildfire. If you all remember back in maybe last year or 2 years ago with the Eagle Creek wildfire in the gorge, people were literally shedding tears about losing this magnificent place to wildfire, when in reality, the gorge was reborn in flames, as our friend Tim would say, and just had a really beautiful and natural fire. So I want Madeline, can you speak a little bit to this myth about the destruction of forests by catastrophic wildfire?
Yeah, so is everyone looking at the slides, or is it live?
I'm seeing like the first page, the first slide still up.
Yeah. It's all
That's what we got.
So yeah, so the media really loves the image of fires burning down our forests and just landscapes. The media really loves that, but in reality, fire is oh, it's moving all over the place. In reality, fire is vital to the health of our fire-adapted ecosystems and forests in the Cascadia bioregion, in many of the different forests. And I had a little map on one of the slides that's kind of fun to look at.
Can you see it now?
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, so go to the next slide. This is a really fun one to look at. It's the historic fire frequency across the whole United States. And if you just focus a little bit on Oregon, and obviously the Cascadia bioregion spans up to Washington and into Canada and Alaska, but you'll see that in Southern Oregon, the fire frequency historically was every 4 to 6 years. So just happening all the time, really. And if you consider all of the different areas of forests, there's going to be fires every year. In the Cascades and the Coast Range, it's a little bit less, around 75 to 100 years. But in some parts of the Coast Range, you can kind of see it. It was closer to 20 years. So fire is a really is part of the landscape here in Cascadia, and so the myth that these fires are destroying our forests is just simply not true, because these forests were born in fire and have been experiencing fire as they've evolved. And yeah, so you're gonna go to the next slide. Cool. So just this is our Cascadia bioregion in the green, but just to focus on a couple chunks that are perhaps close to where the people tuning into this are living. One of them being the Klamath-Siskiyou bioregion. So this has warm and dry forests. There's a large diversity of trees that live in those forests. A lot of ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, as well as lodgepole, and different oaks. And all of these forests depend on fire to recycle the dead and downed needles and limbs to convert them into soil nutrients. And as well, most people think about the redwoods and their cones can't actually, they need fire to open up so they can germinate. So that's a fun one for the kids. So I remember learning that when I was a kid and thinking that was really cool, and thinking about how important fire is to these landscapes. And then if you go to the next slide, in the Willamette region, bioregion, which is where I am in Eugene right now, so it can kind of be thought about in different landscapes. So in the valley, prior to European settlement, indigenous cultures would burn large swaths of the valley for hunting and traveling, but also this helped maintain the oak savanna woodland habitat that used to dominate the area here. And so fire was just always happening in the valley, and it was just a commonplace thing. And a lot of indigenous tribes still today are bringing fire back onto the landscape. And also, and somewhat counterintuitively, the cool and moist forest ecosystems that we have here, we live in a temperate rainforest, and they're really wet, but they still experience fire, and they still rely on fire to regenerate the tree species and allow understory plants to grow. When the fire removes vegetation from underneath, then there's more sun that comes up, and then more vegetation comes. And I'll touch on that a little bit later. I'm sure our other presenters also will expand. But yeah, and then the next slide. This is one of my favorite phrases: pyrodiversity enhances biodiversity. So going back to our myth that the forests are destroyed by these catastrophic wildfires that the media loves to talk about, it's just not true. When we have a healthy fire interact with our forests, it becomes a biological hotspot right after the fire. We got a blackback woodpecker just gorging on all the critters and beetles and insects that populate. And then you can see in this bigger photo, there's lots of life coming up. And then it's kind of hard to tell, but those are morels in the bottom right. There's just a couple of examples of all of the species that thrive and live with fire. And then I think that's, yeah.
And so our next myth, one of the favorite of the logging industry, the timber industry, is that logging or management reduces fire risk. And this is, something we just saw with, Senator Ron Wyden's most recent fire bill, talking a lot about, increased management of our forests to prevent future wildfires. And I'm curious, what do you think about this, Madeline?
Yeah, so the fact is, Sam, next slide. So actually industrial logging, even if they have all of these fancy names like hazardous fuel reduction, fire reduction, they actually 9 times out of 10 will increase the fire risk and spread. So go to the next slide. So so a lot of times so unfortunately, okay, I'll just go. Unfortunately, a lot of our forests in Oregon have been converted from the natural state that that they once were. Going all over the place. That's okay.
Sorry, Madeline, we're having some tech issues. I'm trying to make the slides work, but they're kind of funky. So keep going.
It's all good. Yeah, so unfortunately, our forests have been clear cut for the most part, and then replanted in dense, thick, young trees that that actually are actually a lot more fire prone, and so the Forest Service and the BLM and industry, and like what Dylan just mentioned with Wyden's new bill, there's lots of money and interest in these thinning or hazardous fuels reductions, fuel break construction type projects on our national forests, our public lands. So yeah, so these are both photos that I've taken. The one on the left is blurry for some reason, but this is what I've seen when I go out to the forest. Maybe it's familiar to some of you. You can easily just, trying to make a campfire, you could pick up those deadened down, those sticks on the ground, and make a fire really easily on a hot day in the summer, or even right now. So this is what a lot of our forests unfortunately look like, and so sorry, and so so you can't truly call these hazardous fuels reduction projects, but really fuel relocation projects, because the forest that you saw on the last slide, that's not a commercially viable forest for timber production. So a lot of these projects are focused on second growth or old growth forests that we have, and even if they do go in and they thin and they don't take all of the trees, we call it fuels relocation, because they take the most fire resilient part of the tree out, which is the trunk, and they leave all of the duff and the branches and they just leave that on the ground, and that's that'll look just like the last slide, where it's just flammable material left on the ground, and those are the real fuels. So you can't really call them fuels reduction projects. And I can go to the next slide, if possible. So yeah, so the legacy of clear-cut logging, industrial tree plantation, one after another, has made our forest landscape way more flammable than historically was, even though and at a much higher intensity. So in the photo on the left, it's just all of those trees are densely packed together, and it looks like what happened here was there was a fire, and then they logged, and they just came in and logged it even more. So what was our original myth that thinning or logging can actually help our trees? It's just not true. We need our old growth and larger trees that are not only storing more carbon and holding it in their bodies, but also they're more fire resilient. Like the trees on the right, those are some ponderosa pines. Their bark is adapted and is so thick that they can withstand even a high intensity fire. And even when trees die in a fire, they provide habitat and biodiversity for the land. So yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Madeline. And so now I'm going to pass it off to Mike. And if you want to talk a little bit about your experience in the Forest Service working on wildland firefighting, and kind of debunk this myth that we hear so frequently, which is that logging and firefighting are actually carbon solutions and they preserve the most carbon. Can you tell us a little bit about that, Mike? And you're muted right now, just by the way. I'm trying to unmute you, but I think you might have to do it on your end. Oh,
nice.
There you are.
Nice call on the mute. Yeah, particularly the legacy of logging in the past as they moved across the North America from Appalachia to the Lake States was, exacerbating the fire problem rather than aiding the fire problem. They left a lot of activity fuels that led to larger fires, and that remains a problem even to this day. But in terms of what landscape out there is going to sequester the most carbon, we really do know that the large old growth trees that are standing, those large tree boles, and the soil carbon are the two biggest sources of carbon on that landscape. And light understory fires, dry pine forest type environment, doesn't scour deeply at all into that soil carbon, and it also doesn't volatilize much of the needles and shrubs and overstory. There's the large tree boles are always going to stay behind, except in the most extreme fire we fairly have. So we continue to put on the most carbon, and even though the folks in industry would believe the plantations are putting on the most carbon, over a particular area. It's true. They've removed all the carbon in the first place, and still old growth tree, as far as across the landscape for old growth trees is going to sequester, and that may only be the tree, but that's going to sequester a whole lot more carbon than a whole field of row crops. What's that?
I think folks are having a tough time understanding you, Mike. Maybe try turning off your video and see if that's maybe part of it. But you were kind of cutting in and out throughout that answer. So try turning off your video at the bottom left.
Okay. Is that helpful? I am on a satellite, so I'm not sure if that's helpful or not.
That sounds better to me.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, it's better.
Okay.
Just go slowly.
Okay, that's cool. Well, okay. Well, we were talking about logging and firefighting. That myth that they preserve them carbon. The fact is that logging removes carbon from the landscape, and the old trees that are still standing, from the science of that they are producing more carbon, sequestering more carbon, and that pretty much validates the whole environmental movement, in terms of old growth preservation. The last remaining bits of old growth remain in the West Coast in these temperate forests. Represent.
Hey, Mike, I'm going to stop you there. Is there any chance you can call in? You're really breaking up.
Let me try a different.
Well, we can maybe pass it to Alex for now, and then maybe if you can figure it out, you can come on and present at the end. So, yeah, Alex, do you want to take over the screen share really quickly? And thanks everyone for bearing with us through these technical difficulties. Seems to be the way of things these days is that we're just all at the whim of the internet gods.
Yeah, sorry about the screen share issues, y'all. That was a pain.
Yeah, Dylan, would you like me to jump in, or do you want to ask me an interview question first?
Yeah, well, do you want to bring up your screen share and see if that'll work, and then I can pass it off to you?
Sure.
So you should be a co-host now. Great. So Alex, how does the industry use fire phobia messages to advance its agenda?
That's a juicy question. Well, let me get the full screen here. So as Madeline was kind of highlighting in her presentation, this is one of the big issues that we're facing these days, where industry has picked up on the fact that people are terrified of fire, because fire is scary, like it's objectively scary, and smoke is terrible, and no one likes dealing with smoke. And they've crafted this powerful message that is very politically effective, but it's very scientifically inaccurate. And I was going to walk through basically three different points on how industry utilizes their message and how we can respond with scientifically backed information. So with your question, Dylan, the first point I wanted to respond to is that fire can be scary and it can be very complex and difficult, but fire is not a negative phenomenon on the landscape. Fire does not belong in our communities. It doesn't belong in our neighborhoods, but fire belongs in most ecosystems in the West. Even the moist, wet ecosystems of Western Oregon, Western Washington have seen tremendous amounts of fire over the millennia. On the West side, they're less regular, but they're still an integral part of the ecology. So towards that end, what I want to articulate tonight is this key message that our wildfire policies should advance research-based strategies that make communities more resilient to wildfire instead of futile attempts to control fire behavior over the entire landscape. So there's some language that you should be aware of that sometimes is confusing to people. So the word suppression is sometimes thrown around kind of loosely. Suppression refers to firefighting, actually putting fire out once it's started. Fuels reduction is a preemptive measure of reducing vegetation, so trees and shrubs, to mitigate how severe a fire becomes. So that can be thinning or it can be prescribed fire. And community resilience is adaptation measures such as home hardening and defensible space and whatnot. And I'll get into that later. Those are all separate strategies that work into a larger wildfire strategy. Unfortunately, we see a lot of emphasis on the first two, and we don't see enough emphasis on this third point. And the reason is because industry has found out they can exploit the first two, suppression and fuels reduction, to protect timber from fire and to justify certain areas that are currently not harvestable, to justify opening those places up. So here's some of the rhetoric that you commonly see from the industry. We need to make our forests healthier and more resilient by restoring active management. The thing is, all of those, like forest health, forest resilience, and active management, they're not themselves like bad concepts. They're actually scientifically based concepts. They're just politically utilized to make people feel like they have more control and that fire is bad. Another kind of rhetoric that you commonly see is, frivolous litigation. There's all these environmentalists are stopping all the work in the woods, and our woods are unhealthy, and we need to get folks back in the woods with chainsaws and make our forests healthy again. That's a common political piece of rhetoric that actually is very loaded. It's very complex because there are certain instances where work needs to be done and areas need to be thinned. There was a question in the chat box towards that end. there are certain forests that do need treatment, and almost every environmentalist and conservationist and natural resource manager would agree certain forests need to be thinned. It's a matter of which forests and what kind of thinning and where you're doing that work and how you're doing it. So the complexity is oftentimes lost in the process of politics, no surprise. But it's important to remember this point of our forests having evolved with fire, and they will always find a way of adapting. Sometimes forests will have permanent setbacks and not be able to come back. But the vast majority of the time in the Northwest, when a fire takes place, the landscape recovers. Nature knows how to recover. Even Doug fir and hemlock forests are adapted to large amounts of wildfire. You can see all these photos from Mount Hood of when white folks first showed up to the West. They found a very burned landscape, and it was very patchy. There was a lot of mosaic. And we're used to these green blanketed hills. That's what we think of as Oregon or Washington. Well, it's actually not how these forests evolved. They evolved with more fire than we see now. This last slide here is of the Eagle Creek fire, which freaked a lot of people out, but it's also been a great opportunity to teach people. You can see Mount Hood in the background. This is a helicopter image from the gorge. And what is most interesting to me from this aerial footage and photography is how the fire burned. It wasn't a whole disaster where every tree in the entire gorge died. It's a patchwork. It's a mosaic. This is what you call mixed severity. And wildfire ecologists like to have this fun little saying where diversity, pyro to fire, pyrodiversity begets biodiversity. The more patchiness, the more niches there are to fill. Some woodpeckers are going to move into some of these burned out snags. Some deer are going to come forage on the shrubs that are able to show up because the trees get the heck out of the way. But then there's still intact forest right next to it. And it's that connectivity of the mosaic that is so important. Wildfires love it, or wildflowers love it, wildlife love it. Our forests are adapted to fire. So that's how I respond to industry's fire phobia. Sorry, that was kind of a long answer, Dylan.
No, it's great. So these days there's so much emphasis on thinning and hazardous fuels reduction. How should we be responding to these fuels arguments?
So I kind of framed my entire intro around that concept. So I don't go into a ton of more detail about the political context, but I'll go through a really quick overview of how misplaced the fuels argument is, and how whenever you hear that, say a politician or a friend or whatever responds to you and says that to you, hopefully I'm going to give you a few messaging points that you can respond and say, like, actually that's not quite right, and let me tell you something. So here's what you hear: active forest management, because I like my forest green, not black. Like, that's catchy. That is like, industry knows what they're doing. They are look at this, the name of this organization, Healthy Forests, Healthy Communities. It's actually a timber front group that advocates really aggressive, radical forest policy in Oregon. Which do you prefer? As if it's either or, like either all the trees die or you log them and you get timber products. It's these false dichotomies that are super powerful. Well, there's a problem with this whole thinning love train. It's not backed in science. To thin across an entire landscape and act like you can control fire behavior is not backed in the science. Like I said before, many types of fuels reduction do make sense when they're around communities or when they're in overstocked plantations that have been planted unnaturally. But a lot of the fuels reduction proposals that we're seeing these days really don't make sense. This graphic is a little complicated, but let me make sense of it. All the green trees are the forests in the west. You can see on the left, there's a little icon that says 1 tree equals 1 million acres. So there's 350 million acres of forest in the west, right? Every year, only 3 million of those burn. So you see the red up in the top left. Now, over a 10-year period, the Forest Service and the BLM will thin, mostly, there'll be some prescribed burning, but they will treat 7 million acres. So the idea is that when you thin, it overlaps with where fire's actually going to be. That's the whole concept of thinning, right? It's a thin forest is useless unless a fire encounters that forest. Well, it turns out most thinnings, in fact, 99% of them, do not encounter fire every year. Only 1% of thin forests actually encounter fire every year. This is from the Forest Service's own data. This is explosive. This is an explosive study that came out a few years ago using our government's own data to show how ineffective our wildfire strategies are. Just look how there's this one little part of that 7 million acres actually encounters fire. What actually drives wildfire behavior? It's weather, it's climate. And this graph shows how much more wildfire there used to be before suppression and before industrial forest management. Look at the 30s and the 40s. There were 30 to 40 to 50 million acres burning every year. Look at where we are in the 2015, I think this goes all the way to 2018. We're still seeing, 5 to 10 million acres a year. It's nothing compared to what we saw, almost 100 years ago. And that's largely because of weather. That's largely because there was a hot and dry period during the early 20th century that contributed to wildfire activity being much greater. To make this point even more clear, this is the amount of acres burning in Oregon over the past 5 years. Do you remember last summer how there was hardly any smoke? Wasn't that interesting how Oregon, which is usually a pretty smoky place in August, there was like hardly any smoke last year. And you can see how many less acres based on this graph. Well, the reason is because last summer was an especially wet summer. You can see that this is a drought index from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And usually over the past several years, we've been in drought conditions. But last summer, we actually got more rain and it was cooler than normal. And because of those weather conditions, we actually saw less fire on the landscape. There's a direct correlation. This is the outlook for this summer. And if you want to test what I'm saying, see if it's true, I'm going to predict right now that we're going to see vastly more wildfire activity and much more smoke this summer than we did last summer. And that's because wildfire ecologists and scientists and climatologists have found that wildfire behavior across the landscape is primarily driven by weather, which means there's going to be a lot more fire in the future. And we shouldn't just try to thin our way out of the problem.
Great. And so what is our strongest solution messaging? Which science-based strategy should we rally behind? Because I know so many people often, say logging is the answer, but it's difficult to come up with. So what is the solution?
Yeah, I think it's easy for conservationists and folks who pay attention to environmental issues to poke holes in all the problems. I mean, there's so many problems, and being critical is important, but I also very much believe in advancing real solutions. I think that's the only way we're going to make things better. So good thing there's a lot of science and research out there that shows there are actual tangible things we can do to improve the chances of homes and communities being resilient to wildfire, actually withstanding fire and surviving fires sweeping through a community. And the most important, that I would say is the most important way to limit homes burning down in the summer, we need to limit development in fire-prone forests. That's a politically toxic thing to say. I'm not a politician, so I can tell you that. But if we continue to develop up into the mountains, up into the fire-prone forests, we're going to see more and more and more homes lost every year. That's just a reality. We don't build in flood zones. We don't build right up against the Columbia River, or where I live, there's the Nooksack River. I live in northwestern Washington. People aren't allowed to build along an area that's known to flood. However, people still build all over the forest that is prone to fire. What you see here is where I grew up in Ashland, Oregon, which is a very progressive town when it comes to this kind of thing. Like, Ashland has really limited its growth and development. However, you still see houses sprawling into the Siskiyou Mountains, which are very fire prone and have burned so many times over the centuries, seen less fire recently than they used to. But this is the kind of problem that we need to address first and foremost. The second is to invest in air filters and public smoke shelters. We can't control smoke, and we need to have some humility at what we face in the 21st century and invest in smoke resilience as much as possible. This is especially important in the COVID pandemic era, where people with lung or breathing issues, if they contract COVID, they are already put at a very risky health situation. You add smoke on top of that, and you literally contribute to a dramatic increase in fatalities. And there's some research that's already been going on about this, and how wood burning stoves in people's homes are contributing to exacerbating COVID. So wildfire smoke is going to be really big this year, and this is a really big issue. I'm working with a bunch of coalition partners and medical professionals to send a letter to the legislature asking them to prioritize this particular point for this summer. We'll see if they do it. They're probably going to completely ignore us, but this is how we need to be proactively preparing for smoke. The third way is by hardening homes and by building homes with fire-resistant materials. There has been so much research into what is and what is not effective at protecting homes, and chiefly important amongst those is building homes in the right way, homes that are in fire-prone areas. These photos are taken from the Missoula Fire Lab, which is a federally funded lab in Montana. It's run, I believe, by the U.S. Forest Service, and they conduct all sorts of tests on how fire behaves, like in terms of physics, how the physics of fire operate when they encounter homes. And they've done so much research. We don't need to research this really anymore. We just need to translate the research into policy and actually help communities harden their homes with ember-proof vents. Turns out vents in attics and air vents are a major conduit through which embers can be sucked through. So that's a super simple fix. Another fix is gutter guards that keep dry debris out of your gutters. Another is the siding of your home, or double paned windows. Windows are oftentimes, they break due to heat, and embers can fly right into a house and burn down houses. All right, and the last piece, the fourth one, is to maintain defensible space within 100 feet. So people always say wildfire is the problem. That's why we're losing so many houses. Well, Dr. Jack Cowen, who is a Forest Service scientist, he's actually retired now. He used to work at the Missoula Fire Lab. for decades, much longer than I've been alive. This dude has been studying this exact issue. And here's a quote that I think sums it all up. The wildland-urban interface fire problem. So in other words, the fire problem where communities and fire interact. The fire problem is a home ignition problem, not a wildfire control problem. So let that sink in. It's the reason that homes burn down is because homes are flammable, not because fire's out of control. And Cowen has found, and his research partners have found, that if you control the conditions right around the home, and especially within 100 feet, which is called the home ignition zone, if you control those conditions and you thin out the shrubs and you trim the grass and you make sure no trees are touching your house, if you control that zone and you harden your house, the chances that your home will survive even the most severe wildfire dramatically go up. And that's totally irregardless to what happens in the backcountry. So the key message that I'll leave you with is, by working from the home out rather than from the backcountry in, Oregon can dramatically decrease the likelihood of losing homes to fire. So start where the homes are, start where the communities are, make the communities resilient, and work your way out from there. And that will involve some thinning around where communities live. I totally believe in that. But thinning commercially does not at all belong in forests far away from communities. That is inappropriate, and it's commonly what we're seeing more and more these days. So hopefully that context helps. I would love to answer questions at the very end if that's helpful.
Thank you so much, Alex. And everyone, it looks like we might have to push things back and end maybe around like 6:05 or 6:10. So I hope that's all right with everyone, but it looks like we've got Mike back so he can give a quick wrap up what he was talking about and kind of help us debunk those last few myths. And then we'll have time for questions and a quick outro. So thanks so much, everyone, for bearing with me. And thank you, Alex, for being flexible and jumping in there.
Yeah, you bet.
All right, so Mike, I'm going to unmute you now, but it looks like we've got you. I'm trying to find where you at. Huh. Did we lose Mike? Looks like we might have just lost Mike.
Was he going to call in?
He was on a second ago.
He was on moments ago. Here, let's answer some questions. So it seemed like we had a few in the chat as Alex and Madeline were both presenting. So if anyone has a question, feel free to speak up now, or else we can just pull some from the chat.
I got a question. If everybody can hear me. So my question was kind of on log coming in and log after wildfires go through, salvage logging somewhat, or even forest restoration after wildfires. I've been hearing some people talking about how when wildfires come through, it can sometimes nuke a landscape or like be so hot that it kills everything within it and it doesn't have a chance to really regrow very well. And then I've also heard that there's a chance, especially on Southern Oregon, and the example was the Biscuit Complex. That's pretty controversial because they wanted to do salvage logging down there. But I've heard firsthand kind of experience of the brush grows back faster than the trees can regrow, and it actually shades out any new seedlings that come in. So you end up getting a landscape of brush rather than a new forest that comes through. And you end up getting like close to total mortality of the trees and no new trees coming back through. So does anyone have any thoughts on coming through and like manually reshaping the landscape, since we are having more dramatic fire exposure and fires because of climate change somewhat? Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
It looks like Brodia might have something. And if any of y'all don't know Brodia, she's an awesome advocate down in Southern Oregon region. So I'm going to unmute you. Sorry to put you on the spot if you weren't really answering.
Sorry, I'm just pulling up the...
Looked like you were like really passionately like,
yeah. Biscuit. I was hiking in the Kalmiopsis all weekend, so I was looking at the regrowth of Biscuit. And since Biscuit, you know, there's been the Klondike, there's been the Checo Bar fire before Klondike. So there's been a wide variety of fire effects down here. I was looking for this particular site, and I might not be able to find it, but it talks about seed sources available after high severity fire. And if I can find it, I will put it in the chat and a link to the paper. I'm just gonna scroll through my computer looking for it. But I think salvage logging is often disguised as forest restoration when in reality it does a lot more damage to the landscape than acknowledged in any NEPA documents. So I would say that in terms of fire and fire messaging, it goes really hand in hand with the logging industry's logging equals no fire. So if you cut down all the trees, you can't have a fire, and then everyone's safe. And that's a really easy message for people to understand because all of this, historic range of variability and mixed fire regimes and mosaics are so complex and so nuanced and take a lot to kind of unpack and understand. And I think that messaging is really real, as Alex pointed out. Objectively, people are scared of fire down here. The Checo Bar fire threatened Brookings, and the town of Brookings is a small coastal community that may or may not be able to respond to that, right? And their county commissioners and state representatives are really pro salvage logging. And then you look at kind of the differences. We have a lot of differences between Forest Service versus BLM, and then down here in the KS, the Rogue River Siskiyou versus the Klamath National Forest. And so, like, for example, the Miller Complex fire was a 2017 fire. The Abney fire within the Miller Complex fire burned on both the Rogue River Siskiyou and the Klamath. The Klamath launched a, humongous late successional reserve salvage logging project that nuked the whole landscape, where the Rogue River Siskiyou just did ingress and egress on the existing road system. And just like a difference, it's the same fire effects burned on two different forests that happened to cross the state border. And then these two responses are completely, politically charged, and that's kind of how they're informed. So I think it's really, salvage logging is a hoax.
And you can all catch Brodia with more information on our Wildchat next week.
Nice. Does that answer your question, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it is like the industrial side of it. Their whole take on it, salvage logging is for money. But is there a in-between area where it's like we do need to restore a forest, otherwise have a heavier human hand, otherwise it'll just be brush somewhat if it does have 100% mortality? Is there a chance that we might have to step in, since we have prevented wildfires for so long that they're burning differently, so we have to kind of respond to that in our way?
I found the site I was looking for. Natural conifer regeneration on sites that experienced high severity fire was a variable but generally abundant, with a median stocking density of 767 seedlings per hectare of primarily Douglas fir. Such densities exceeds regional standards for fully stocked sites, suggests that active reforestation efforts may be unnecessary. Post-fire logging subsequently reduced regeneration by 71% to 224 seedlings per hectare due to soil disturbance and the physical burial of woody materials during logging operations. Thus, if post-fire logging is conducted in part to facilitate reforestation, replanting could result in no net gain in early conifer establishment. And that's a Donato study off the Biscuit. And I can put a link to it in the chat.
Yeah,
that'd be great.
So maybe that was helpful, I hope.
It was super helpful.
And then we'll include the link to that as well in the follow-up, so everyone can have a chance to look at it. Great. Are there any other? I see one question that maybe Madeline answered in the chat about thinning or burning to help restore oak savanna. Madeline, do you want to just speak a little bit specifically to that?
Yeah, so the question was if you can, like, kind of where can we thin, or where is it appropriate? And Alex did a really great job of explaining close to communities is the number one place for that. But also around here in the lower elevation part of the Willamette Valley, prescribed fire is used on oak savanna woodland ecosystems to thin out lower vegetation on the ground and help stimulate growth. So there are some, and I also mentioned in the chat, there are times when thinning certain trees by hand crews can be really effective and less destructive to a landscape. So commercial thinning, they have to bring in big machines, feller bunchers, they build roads, create erosion. That's going to be a lot more damaging than some people out in the woods using chainsaws and taking a few trees out.
Awesome. So it looks like we have one last question, and then maybe we have a mystery caller dialing in that I'm hoping is Mike, who can at least give us a 5-minute spiel about wildfire or wildland firefighting. Is that you, Mike?
Yeah, I'm here.
Awesome. Okay, just hold them tight. We got one question about as climate change is changing tree species in the Pacific Northwest, how can we replant and restore forests with the least, I don't know how to pronounce this word, deleterious effects? And Sam, you want to just jump in really quick and give a quick answer so we can let Mike take it off just for the last couple minutes? Oh.
I mean, I don't know that I have a really great answer, and this is a huge conversation, but all I said was that we're seeing timber sales more and more that seek to do that in the name of climate resiliency, logging healthy Douglas fir forests, often very old healthy Douglas fir forests, for ponderosa pine reintroduction and sometimes oak reintroduction. It's complicated. I think it's like really site specific and really controversial. That's my answer. I definitely want to hear Mike talk too.
And it looks like Mike has again disappeared from the conversation.
He'll have to remain a mystery. It looked like Alex wanted to add something to what I just said, though.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, I think Sam mentioned that it's very complex. It's actually very, very, very complex because we don't know what's going to happen in the future. It's up to us how much the climate changes, and it's probably going to change really fast. So who knows how much control we really have. My personal view, based on the science that I've read, we need to work with natural systems as much as possible while leaning in with certain forms of active restoration. That's going to be really, really complex, but wildfire could be such an opportunity. After a stand replacing fire, if we're going to replant, we can then start thinking of how redwood and how ponderosa pine and how grand fir and certain species that are currently in limited areas, how wildfire can actually help us transition forests and move things to higher latitudes.
Great. And now we have got Mike back on. So Mike, quickly talk to us about wildland fire fighting and the kind of propaganda that the timber industry is pushing forward about how we need to fight the fires to stop climate change, etc.
Well, you have the two myths. One of the myths was the story that carbon is somehow better sequestered through logging, when in fact we know that the best thing to have happen, even with intermittent wildfires, is to allow large diameter trees out in the landscape to keep growing. We know that those old growth trees represent the best store of carbon on the landscape, and we don't want them going anywhere. There's a tremendous amount of carbon emitted, not only with wildfires, but also with the logging practices to get those wood products, eventually to your home. The timber industry will say a lot about sequestering carbon by way of timber and logging, and that sort of thing. But we know that we want to preserve the old, large diameter trees, and the best way to keep them on the landscape, keep them resilient from future fires, is to do occasional understory burning, particularly in those dry pine forests. The biggest store of carbon is in the big tree boles and in the soil carbon, and unless it's a big catastrophic huge wildfire, it generally doesn't scour very deeply into that soil carbon, nor does it volatilize those big tree boles. So just to say that was one of the myths that we were talking about, and the fact is that we want to keep fires on the landscape where they can be not a bother to the homes and communities. As like Alex was saying earlier, we need to do that thinning and that kind of activity in close to the homes. But like Dr. Cowen's work suggests, that after you get 100 feet away, you're done with any direct flame impingement. Embers can be lofted for miles in a big severe fire, but it comes back to those building codes and building homes in such a way that they're resilient more to fire. So that's one of the myths, is that somehow logging better sequesters carbon, and we know that is not right. And as far as what was the fourth myth that we were talking about? It was Alex already covered it. The fact that that we're having more fires now due to climate change, and while we are seeing an uptick, because fires are generally driven by weather and climate, and that includes putting them out. By the way, it's not always the firefighters. It's usually the firefighters will take credit for the suppression when they get a break from the weather, but it's usually the weather that changes that allows most of the suppression folks to get a handle on things. And of course, suppression comes with a host of impacts as well. Dozers, aircraft dropping a lot of retardant getting into ephemeral streams and into critical habitat sometimes for fisheries. But there's a tremendous amount of destruction potentially to cultural sites as well. The bulldozers and building big Wildcat lines along ridge tops tend to be in a lot of the same places where cultural sites are. So we want to recognize that there's not really an increasing amount of fire, though what the two other things besides climate at play are, the increasing development into the wildlands, and the second thing is the accumulation of fuels that we really haven't gotten a handle on. We're not doing enough burning. We're not allowing enough fires to burn in remote areas. So we need to continue to promote that, and it's going to be difficult in the climate change era. Initially the agency said they really wanted to hammer everything hard, keep it small. Everybody constantly falls back to that default 10 a.m. policy of fire exclusion, when in reality, like Stephen Pine says, we don't have too much fire, and we have too much combustion and not enough open fire in those places where we can support it. And now, of course, with particulate matter being an important component in fatalities and susceptibility to COVID, and the situation with shelters, if there are large fires that require mass evacuations, it's going to be a really bad situation. In shelters, they're going to be spreading people out. So the call for suppression is going to be stronger than ever. And they would like to also claim that they're saving carbon and sequestering carbon in those fire suppression efforts, but we know that's not the case either.
Beautiful. Thank you, Mike. And I hate to cut it a little short on those answers because you have so much knowledge to impart, but we are a little bit over time, and I really want to thank everybody for being patient and flexible with some of the technological difficulties. But hey, as we wrap up, I want to ask and encourage you all to join our WildCAT team. That's the Cascadia Action Team. We're a grassroots group of folks who are out surveying forests, leading marches and protests and just doing general grassroots organizing to protect these forests and to advocate for not only conservation but for environmental justice. And I think Wildfire is really exemplary of kind of that overlap, where there are so many of these rural low-income communities that are the most at risk from the industrial mismanagement of our forests by timber barons. And that's a really big part of what we do. And so Sam is going to drop some links into the chat. We're having our next big meeting next Thursday at 6, I believe. So you can just, and it's all on Zoom right now, but hopefully soon we'll be back in the office. There's usually free beverages and food, and it's a great place to connect with folks and to gain some really great skills. Additionally, I also want to plug that one of our supporters is matching donations this month for up to $10,000. So if you've got a couple extra dollars to spare, every single cent helps. And we really, really appreciate all of your support, whether it's being a body at our events, being a voice advocating for our forests, or if just it's donating some money. It all is so, so valuable to putting forth messaging and kind of counteracting the industry's messaging and protecting the wildlands and protecting the rural communities who are the most at risk from this industrial mismanagement. So with that, I'm gonna wrap it. Thanks everybody, and thanks so much to our panelists, Alex, Madeline, and Mike. Appreciate it. Take care.